Okay, Boker Tov, good morning everyone. I would like to welcome you all to this joint event by the Rubinstein Center for Constitutional Challenges here at Reichman University, together with Tachlit Institute for Israeli Policy. This is our second joint event. Last year we had Justice Breyer, and this year we are honored to have Professor Marta Cartabia and Professor Joseph Weiler. And the topic that was chosen for this event is democracy without a demos, or a question mark. Can there be a democracy without a demos? Can democracy function when society is so fragmented, so polarized? I'll give you just maybe one example from the Israeli case. In the previous government, that was the anti-Netanyahu government, if you recall, one of the Knesset members, Miri Regev, stated at the Knesset the following. She said, look, whichever law the coalition brings, we will vote against. Never mind what the law is. If it's a law that benefits women, we vote against. If it's a law that benefits kids, we vote against. If it's a law that benefits soldiers, we vote against. Because we have no tummy aches. And if you have a tummy ache before the vote, you take a pill. We will have no tummy aches because we have one aim, to make sure that this government falls. And to my mind, this is a disaster for democracy. This is a disaster because what does this approach mean for volonté générale, for the general will, for the greater public interest? If all you care about is we and them, enemy and friend, they and us, we cannot function as a society. So I am extremely glad that Professor Weiler and Professor Cartabia have suggested this topic, because I think it is crucial. It is crucial worldwide, but especially to Israel nowadays. So I welcome you all to this event. I would like to invite Professor Lior Zemer, our Dean of the Law School, to say a few words of greetings.
Good morning, Professor Marta Cartabia, Professor Joseph Weiler, colleagues, friends, students, and guests. Well, the title of this conference is perhaps one of the most accurate expressions of the present socio-political situation in Israel. The polarized Israeli society is proud to call itself a democracy. At times, this pride is at risk, and in other times, it does not really meet reality, as we've heard from Yaniv. A question that was recently asked is what happens when democracies become perniciously polarized. Living in Israel and personally experiencing living in other countries and polarized societies, I myself can attest that when a democracy becomes perniciously polarized, there are ample reasons, constitutional and institutional, for concerns. Political divide forces legislatures to agree on bad compromises, erodes institutional norms, and encourages politicians and other government officials to endorse their own aims and interests. Polarized societies are flourishing, and in those countries, like Israel, that are most badly affected, we see the people dividing themselves in such a way that mimic, to some extent, religious patterns. We see a growing sentiment to us versus them mindset, a sentiment that poses a serious risk to social stability. I hope you will discuss today some ways to overcome these risks. I would like to thank the Tachlit Institute and the Rubinstein Center for joining forces and collaborating. And I would like also to thank Tal Schusinger from Rubinstein Center and the events office of the Reichman University. I wish you a great and enjoyable symposium, and my apology that I cannot stay with you long. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Professor Zemer. I would like to call Mr. Yaniv Cohen, the chair of Tachlit Institute. I'm so happy that Tachlit are joining forces with us together today, because Tachlit's main Tachlit means purpose. Tachlit's main Tachlit is to find areas of consensus, of agreements. And we thought that they would be the perfect match to engage in such a debate. So Yaniv, please.
Good morning. Thank you, Yaniv. Professor Cartabia, Professor Weiler, Professor Zemer, Professor Roznai, Dr. Gil, dear guests, they say that old habits die hard. Dori. They say that old habits die hard. Unfortunately, in Israel, we have an old habit that came back to our lives in the past few days, and that is to wake up in the morning with a list of new soldiers that were killed. And this morning we woke up with Adidi Azugi, Eliyahu Hillel, and Diego Shoisha that were killed last night or yesterday in the Gaza Strip. And with the other 125 hostages that are still being kept in Hamas hands. So I think it's a good thing for us to start this morning with putting that in memory, because it's not just the context of Israel. I think it's an important context for our entire discussion. When we started to prepare to that event, we felt in Tachlit, as part of our partnership with the Rubinstein Center, that is a good opportunity to put our theory of change, of Tachlit's theory of change, on the table. We believe that policy, in a polarized society, policy is one of the best ways to transcend political borders, to transcend divides. This is what we try to do in our research center. And last night, preparing that greetings, my Twitter popped with something from Channel 14, one of the Israeli outlets, with the following headline: "Do political positions save lives?" And it was an entire piece about a research, I don't know, that says that people with right-wing inclination or left-wing inclination die more in this particular war or less. I don't really care. I think it's irrelevant. And at the same time, by the way, 10 minutes afterwards, I heard a new elected politician that was recorded in one of his closed sessions say that one of the ways in that particular war to resist the government is insubordination, but of reservists, not civic insubordination, but military insubordination. And I feel that we all live in Israel, we all live in a polarized society, and we all live in the context that we're part of. I feel if that we will let the margins to lead us, we will be in a very bad shape in the coming future. And therefore, I'm happy to be part of this debate, of this discussion that tries to look at those angles of society polarization for the point of view of policy. Throughout the last 15 months, we in Tachlit, or even more, 18 months since the reform was announced by Minister Levin, we in Tachlit tried to find ways to close the gap and to find areas of consent on multiple issues in Israeli public discourse, but for that particular venue, on the issue of the rules of democratic game in Israel. We haven't succeeded yet in accomplishing most of our goals. And Dr. Gil is smiling here because he lost many hours of sleep doing so, trying to do so. But we are optimistic. And if there is one message that I would like to convey today to the participants here and those who view us at home, is that one of the ways to deal with political polarization is being optimistic and coming with a vast level of enthusiasm to that task, because otherwise we will definitely not succeed. So thank you all, and let's have a pleasant discussion.
Thank you very much, Yaniv. So, without further ado, let's begin our discussion. I would like to invite Professor Marta Cartabia to the stage, and let me, in the meanwhile, just introduce our two distinguished guests. I've written it, so I'll read from the paper. Excuse me, slicha, chaverim. It's just too long. I didn't want to confuse myself. So, we will begin with a presentation by Professor Joseph Weiler. Professor Weiler is a university professor, the Joseph Strauss Professor of Law, European Union, Jean Monnet. No need for the entire...
Everybody has Google. You'll also see the stuff I don't want you to know. So, and my children are not here.
So okay, I accept Professor Weiler's, that everyone can Google him, but let me just say one thing. Apart from being a law professor and formerly being the president of the EUI at Florence, etc., he was also, and I urge all the students here to do that on YouTube, to look for him. He was also representing Italy and 8 states before the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights. But in a very interesting case, the Lauzi case, that protected the right of schools to put crucifix on the wall. So, and Joseph Weiler, maybe I should also mention, is an Orthodox Jew. And he did it, I think, pro bono, just because of that reason. Joseph, correct me if I'm wrong. So we are very honored to have Professor Weiler here. And maybe, Joseph, one more thing. 2 years ago, Joseph was awarded the Roznai Prize by the Pope. So I think that is something that is worth mentioning. And just aside to Professor Weiler, we have Marta Cartabia. Again, I'll be very brief. You can Google it. But Marta she's a professor of law, but she was also a judge at the Constitutional Court of Italy. She was the deputy president and the president of the Constitutional Court of Italy. And later she was the minister of justice during really hard times in Italy, during COVID. And let me just emphasize maybe one thing. When Professor Cartabia was called to serve as the Minister of Justice, they told her, look, we have to do a huge reform in our judicial system because of the EU. There are many waiting times in trials. Civil trials, criminal trials, they take years. This is impossible. You have to come and save us. And she proposed 2 reforms in the judicial system, in the civil system, and in the criminal justice system. And she had a huge success, and now trials are, I think, around 25% less than they used to be before. And I'm only emphasizing it because I think that also in Israel, this is the reform that we need in judicial system, not dealing with risomness or other things. This is the reform that could really help the citizens. So I admire you for this success, Marta, and I give the floor now to Joseph Weiler to give his talk. Joseph, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'll start with an apology. I'm a conscientious objector to PowerPoint. And of course, I'm very grateful and honored to have been invited, but it's a particular pleasure to be with Marta Cartabia. I will say something about that. I'm an old professor. I'm old. My next birthday, I will be 73. There's a phase in your career where your students or mentees go around the world and say, Joseph Weiler was my professor, Joseph Weiler was my mentor. And now I'm at the phase where I say, Marta Cartabia was my student.
But I still go around and say Joseph Weiler is my
So, I wish I had $1 for every article that we received at ICON, which was writing about populism and democratic slide. And they are very important articles, and the problem of democratic slide is very real. But usually the analysis goes as follows. Democratic slide in today's world is different from the colonel's regime, a coup d'etat, etc. It's all done under the formal guise of the law. So it's more insidious because it looks legitimate. So that's the first point that in discussion of populism and democratic slide is always emphasized. It's not the colonels taking over, but it's under the guise of the law. And the second thing, one analyzes the techniques of democratic slide, taking over the press, trying to pack the court, changing the rules of election, etc. Everything done legally. But we look at the institutions which are meant to guarantee democracy, and they are perverted. What I want to do today is to say that if we talk about populism and democratic slide, there is a deeper and more profound risk change which has not been noticed so much. And unfortunately, in my view, it's irreversible. So I want to first explain the connection between demos and democracy. Demos does not translate well. Sometimes they say nation. That's not a good translation. People is probably a better translation. So you see in the word democracy, there's demos and krasi. It's the rule by the people. And my claim is it's not just a lexical, a question of language. It's ontological. It defines democracy. I want to give you an example which will drive home the point that if there's no demos, there cannot be democracy. So let's imagine the following situation. You go to the Danes, or you go to the Canadians, and you say to them, to the Danes, why don't you join Germany? It's a wonderful democratic country, which it is. Or you can say to the Canadians, why don't you become part of the United States? It's a democratic country, you will be equal citizens, you can be elected to the presidency, etc. And the reply will be, thank you, but no thank you. Because if we Danes join Germany, it will be Germans ruling Danes. And that's not democratic. The Canadians will say, we don't challenge American democracy, but we are Canadians, we want to rule ourselves. And if we join the United States, for us it will not be a democracy, it will be Americans ruling Canadians. I tell you something about democratic theory. The basic principle of democratic theory is majority rule. There are free elections. One party wins the elections, and one accepts that if they are the majority, we have to abide by the laws they say. Interestingly, democratic theory has a little bit difficulty to explaining something that is axiomatic. So one explanation is, it's just the definition of democracy. You don't need to theorize it. That's what democracy means. Free elections, the majority rules. Other located in terms of the principle of equality. If it's going to be the rule by the people, if it's not the majority rules, it means that some people are worth less than others. There's no real clean solution to that question because it seems to us so axiomatic, and it's right. Democracy means the majority rules. not in a totalitarian way. We don't allow a tyranny of the majority. That's why we have fundamental human rights. But all democratic theorists agree that the principle that the majority rules is only when there is a demos. And that's why you go back to the example of the Danes joining Germany and the Canadians joining the United States. Even though these are democratic countries, they would say this is not democracy, it's Canadians ruling, Americans ruling Canada, etc. Now, where do we see the problem of demos and democracy in contemporary life? We see it particularly in one type of situation. I'll give you 3 examples and you will immediately get the point. Catalonia, Quebec, Scotland. The Catalans who are clamoring for secession from Spain and becoming an independent Catalonia are not saying that Spain hasn't got a democratic constitution, democratic practices, etc. They're not saying that. They're just saying, we are not Spanish. It's Castilians ruling Catalans. And that's our claim for independence. It's not saying it's not a democracy, we are being repressed, etc. The Quebecois are saying the same thing. They're not claiming that Canada is not a democracy. They're saying we are not Canadians in the sense that the Anglo-Protestants Canadians think of themselves. We are French-speaking, we are Catholic. We think of ourselves as a different nation, and that's why we want independence, because it's Anglo-Protestants ruling French-speaking Catholics. And the Scottish say a similar thing. We're not challenging that the United Kingdom is not a democracy, but we are different. We don't belong to the British demos. We are Scottish. That's where we see it. And there are different replies to that. In Spain, it says, okay, but it has to be a referendum among all Spanish. United Kingdom was more risky. They say, okay, let's give a referendum to the Scottish. If they really feel that way, they should be able to secede. There was a referendum, and there wasn't a majority for secession. What is different in the situation that we are confronting, and I'm going to give Israel as an example, although I could talk about Poland, I could talk about the United States. My claim is, and I'm setting aside the problem of the Arab minority in Israel, I'm just talking about, to make the discussion simple, I'm just talking about the Jewish majority in Israel. My claim is there is no longer a Jewish demos. And if there's no longer a Jewish demos, if the principle no demos, no democracy, it means there cannot really be a democracy here. So I'm a little bit like the Economist magazine. If I had my way, I would put on the title page, simplify and exaggerate. So I'm a little bit simplifying and exaggerating, but I'm standing behind my claim. So there are going to be 2 issues. The first issue, so how do we define a demos to be able to say there's no more demos? And the second is, what do we do when the demos is fractured, but it is not fractured the way Catalonia, Scotland, and Quebec, where they also have a territorial integrity? So there the solution is either secession or autonomy. So Catalonia probably has the most advanced form of autonomy that we have known in history. Quebec has a large, and that's saying you are still part of Spain, you are still part of Canada. Scotland has huge autonomy over vast areas of public life, but we recognize that we are dealing with 2 demoi. That's the plural of demos is demoi. And therefore, we will give you a large degree of autonomy in order to be able to say we are still a democratic state, because we will redefine our demos as a demos of demoi, a nation of nations, but it's still the Spanish nation. A nation of nations, but it's still Canada. A nation of nations, but it's still a United Kingdom. And if everybody accepts that, it works. The secessionists in Scotland are not happy. The secessionists in Quebec are not happy. The secessionists in Catalonia are not happy. But overall, people are saying that's a way of accepting that we are dealing with two demoi. The situation in Israel, and to a lesser extent in Poland, and to a lesser extent in the United States today, is that that solution is not offered because we don't have the overlap of the sense of separate demos with a geographical that you can say, we will give you autonomy in Quebec, we will give you an autonomy in Scotland, we will give you an autonomy. Here we have, in my view, the fractured Israeli demos is everywhere. It's in Tel Aviv, it's in Jerusalem, it's in the north, in the south. Wherever you go, and I will try and substantiate my claim, we see the fractured demos. So that kind of solution, either secession or a large degree of autonomy, doesn't work in this kind of situation. It wouldn't work in Poland, it wouldn't work in the United States, and that type of solution cannot work in Israel. And here we have a conceptual and theoretical deficit. Now, you know, my scholar colleagues, whenever you think you have an original idea, it just means you've done poor research. Somebody has been there before you. Pardon?
This is Marta's PhD thesis on unconstitutional amendments.
It's a little bit different. I know. Not everybody read it. But, I haven't found any writing that deals with the problem of demos and democracy and that goes beyond the Quebec, Scotland, Catalonia problem. I don't find writing what descriptively and analytically, what happens when you have a democracy with a fractured demos which does not split geographically or linguistically, etc., but especially geographically. So, first of all, descriptively, what could we expect? Normatively, what do we do with this? I cannot find any writing on that because it's a relatively new phenomenon. When it happened in the past, what we saw was civil war. In the history of the Jewish people, it's not the first time. If you read, I'm sure for some of you it will be the first time, maybe for most of you, if you read the book of Maccabees, it is exactly this problem. The book of Maccabees is not the Jews against the Greeks, היהודים נגד היוונים. It's היהודים נגד המתייוונים. It's the Jews against the Hellenized Jews. And it was a bloody civil war. The description, the river was red by the blood, not of the Greeks, but of the civil war. And rabbinical Judaism won. So now we have to go and ask, how do we define a demos in order to be able to say that the demos is fractured? Now, this issue does emerge in international law, in the law of self-determination, because the right to self-determination is defined when you have a people. And international law doesn't give an answer. Because let's think how difficult it is to find criteria that will define a demos, a people. You can say a common language. Look at Switzerland. There are 3 languages. They definitely feel very Swiss. You could say a common religion. Look at Germany. It's split more or less 50-50 between Catholics and Protestants. They feel German. I could give you history, for example. The problem with history is that people read it differently. If you look at American history and you ask Americans, so to speak, to define the history, it will be a very different story if you ask Native Americans to define American history. You will hear 2 different stories. The same is true with Australia and the Aborigines. So even history is a difficult criteria. And then this is an illumination by a great German public law scholar, Birkenförder. The way one people differs from another people is also how they understand their very own peoplehood. So the classic example, which is challenged, but it's evocative, Germans understand their nationhood in ethno terms, and the French as a community of values. It's not exactly true, but there's some truth to it. The point is that even in understanding what defines a people, they are different. There are no agreed criteria. So ultimately, it's a subjective feeling. Do we feel like the Swiss, despite a difference, there are French speakers and German speakers and Italian speakers, we are all Swiss? Or the Germans, despite Catholic and Protestants, and today the new religion, secularism, we are all German? It's a subjective criteria. How does international law solve it? By recognition. If you persuade states that you are separate people, you are separate people. If you don't, you are not. And the results can be arbitrary. Is Northern Cyprus a separate people, the Turkish minority in Northern Cyprus? International law hasn't recognized it. In Bangladesh, they did. So you see, it's difficult to find a criterion of demos, and ultimately it turns out to be a subjective, social, psychological element. So now let's get closer once again to the relationship between demos and democracy. What manifests a demos in relation to democracy? Polarization is a little bit too easy. Why? There's a general election in Britain called for the 4th of July, 5 weeks from now. Believe me, it's a polarized society. Between Labour and the Tories, they don't agree on anything. And they feel passionately about it. I hate the Tories. I hate the Socialists, the Labour Party. They really feel passionate about it. And they say this is a fundamental election, it will define the future of Britain, etc. Brexit was one of the cleavages. People felt very passionately about it. But it's still a demos. Why is it a demos? Because nobody is claiming that if the Tories win again or if Labour win again, it will not be a legitimate election. Everybody says, I know if Labour win, there will be fundamental changes in foreign policy. They will recognize Palestine. In taxation, they will soak the rich and redistribute to the poor on a whole range of issues. But that's what democracy means. And we hope next time we will win the elections and privilege the rich people as we've been doing, etc. And especially, it's not even part of public debate to touch the institutions of democracy. Reform the health service, yes, but Parliament, the courts, the Office of Attorney General, etc., everybody accepts these are state institutions. And they will work with the Labour government and they will work with the Conservative government. So deep polarization, really deep polarization. In Brexit it was, but we are all British, so we will accept the results, and the institutions of the state remain the institutions of the state. there you see the connection between demos and democracy, despite having a society which on political and social issues is very deeply polarized. So now, what are the characteristics of a demos that is fractured? And we're taking the hard example because it's not a Catalonia, it's not a Scotland, etc. Let's look at Israel. There's deep political polarization. I wish I could say it's 50-50, but it's not 50-50. I'm just talking about the Jewish population in Israel. But the polarization is as deep as you can see in any political society. There's a conceptual difference in how to understand Israel. It's the difference between the Herzl vision, Medinat HaYehudim, the state of the Jews. Herzl was a secular Jew, accepting, now I'm opening a footnote, what sometimes others, outside Israel and outside the Jewish people, fail to understand, that from its inception, Judaism was both peoplehood and a religion. You cannot say meaningfully a secular Christian. If you're secular, you're not Christian. If you're an atheist, you cannot say a Christian atheist. If you're an atheist, you're not a Christian. But you can say an atheist Jew. Plenty. If I look at the Jewish people around the world, all 14 million, probably a majority are atheist Jews or secular Jews. So Judaism is both peoplehood and religion. For centuries, the two were together. But for at least the last 250 years, there's a split. And the Zionist movement was a secular movement of socialists, but feeling very strongly their Jewish identity as a people. So when Herzl writes Medinat HaYehudim, it's the state for the Jews as a people. And there's an alternative concept, Medina Yehudit, a Jewish state. You see there's a real fundamental difference between thinking of Israel as a Jewish state, תחבורה ציבורית בשבת, or a state of the Jews. It's a fundamental difference. And I'm claiming that part of the cleavage or the fracture of the Jewish society in Israel is also along that line. Those who understand Israel as the state of the Jews and those who understand Israel as a Jewish state. The cleavage overlaps, not 100%, but even 60-70% helps my case, socioeconomically. Israel as a state of the Jews is socioeconomic groups, typically 1 and 2. Israel as a Jewish state, even if they're not very observant, they go to watch football on Shabbat, but they still are sympathetic to the notion of a Jewish state. Socioeconomic groups, I say it's not 100%, it's 60%, etc., 3, 4, and 5. It also manifests itself geographically, although not quite in the Catalonia way. It's the difference between central urban Tel Aviv and the periphery. If we look at the election results, periphery Tel Aviv, we see the same kind of cleavage that I am describing. I could give you more indicators. All I'm wanting to say, and I will reach the main criteria in exactly 120 seconds, 2 minutes, is that there's a stronger case for a fractured demos if we have those overlapping cleavages. Conception of the state, socioeconomically, periphery and center, etc. But now I come exactly to the notion I said when we try and define what is a demos, and we say it's ultimately a subjective feeling. This is where the strongest case can be that Israel has no longer a Jewish demos in the way we understand demos for the purposes of democratic discourse. You are not real Jews. Ganavtem lanu et hamedina. You have stolen the state from us. It can be said on one side or the other side, but you understand that that's a very powerful expression. It's an expression, I have a concept of the state. That state belongs to me because of my conception of the state, whether it's Medina Yehudit, a Jewish state, or a state of the Jews, which typically means a liberal democracy state. It belongs to me and you have stolen it from me. For me, I could give you a million examples. You know them because you read them every day in the newspaper, and you probably read them more than I do because I'm not only a conscientious objector to PowerPoint, I'm also a conscientious objector to all social network. You will not find me on Twitter. I think they now call it X. You will not find me on, what's it called? Facebook, Instagram, etc. But I'm sure that all of you have a Facebook account. Am I wrong? Raise your hand. Now it's TikTok and Instagram. Raise your hand if you don't have a Facebook account. So Instagram or TikTok. I'm right or am I right? So I'm sure what I see in the mainstream press, you see even to a greater extent on social network. In other words, a discourse which is different from the British discourse. The British discourse is, I hate those Tories, or I hate those Labour socialists. But you don't see they are not British. You just don't see that. It's not part of the social and political imagination. Here, we see this every day. They are not real Jews. They are betraying the dream of Israel, Megillat Ha'atzmaut, as a liberal state for all Jews. They are trying to make it into a Jewish state, etc. So I could go on, but I want to end here my case. It's a fractured demos. What does it now mean? And as I say, this is terra incognita, unexplored territory. How do we imagine democracy when there is no demos? So some things are easy. It's just a challenge to the legitimacy of power. In other words, Trump saying they stole their election. They are not real Americans, etc. So there's a deep seat. They might be ruling. They might have won the election, but it's not my government because I voted Likud or I voted Avodah, etc. It's not my government because it's not my people. It's a different form of illegitimacy. And then what I think will happen if it doesn't descend to civil war, and I don't want to talk about the civil war option, not because I don't think it's impossible, but because it's more interesting to see if a society shies away from a military coup d'etat or from a civil war and still wants to function as a formal democracy with elections, etc., but without a demos. What I see to a degree, which we already see, but to a much greater degree, whoever wins the elections will not simply try to have more socialist policy or more conservative policy, but try to convert the institution of the state, to conform to their way of thinking of Hamedina sheganavtem meitanu. We have to try and consolidate it so it cannot be stolen again. And the only way we can do that is to ensure that we will go on ruling. Because if, God forbid, we lose the next election, we are back to square one. I'm going to finish with one proposition. Why do I say that unlike maybe we have a solution, I don't see a solution? And I could give a similar talk in Poland, etc. Because there's a catch-22 here. Let's say, as in Poland, the right wins the election and they begin to subvert the institutions of democracy. Hypothetically. And then there's an election and the left win. So now they have to undo the subversion of the institution of democracy. Obviously, right? That's what the new Polish government is trying to do. Why is it a catch-22? Because it sends the signal that whoever wins the election has the legitimacy to tinker with the institutions of the state and institution and democracy. I don't see how one can get out of that catch-22. Thank you.
Wow.
Easy task, Marta.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Joseph, for putting me at my ease in this conversation. No, well, indeed, I'm not going to comment on the Israeli situation. I'm not entitled to do this. I will try to give you some remarks from the point of view, another perspective, the perspective of an Italian, of a European, that is not looking at such a dramatic situation, extreme situation, as it was described concerning the Israeli society, but nevertheless is witnessing something that is unprecedented, even in societies where the question of the demos is not yet, the demos is not yet under question, but still, let's use the word polarization, fragmentation, maybe not fractured, but similar dynamics are taking place. Indeed, as usual, when you listen to Joseph, the feeling is that he always goes to the fundamental, the basic questions. We have been writing about the democratic slide, the crisis of democracy and so on. The feeling is that all the others are looking at the surface of things and you go deep to the origin of the problems. And indeed, I think that the question that he is asking, democracies are falling apart because the people, the demos, is falling apart, is a real issue. Demos is the heart of a country. And I told him when we decided to have this talk together, I remind that his talk reminds me to a famous sentence said by one of the founding fathers at the origin of Italy. Probably you are not familiar with the Italian history, but Italy was not a country until very recently. I mean, not compared to Israel, but Italy was born out of a process of unification of a myriad of small states in Italy. And it took a long time, wars, battles, and so on, until Italy was unified in 1861. The interesting comment by one of the protagonists of this unification, Massimo d'Azeglio, was that he said, okay, now having made Italy, we now must make Italians. Because it is true. While we were commenting with some friends and colleagues that in Italy, you still have big differences among, I don't know, the north and the south, and different regions are the expression of a different culture, not only, you know, different styles, but until very recently, the feeling of being foreign people and not really linked by the same culture was still very strong in Italy. But in my view, that comments by Massimo d'Azeglio is interesting because it goes to the point that Joseph was mentioning. You cannot have democracy if you don't feel that you belong to the same people. You mentioned Böckenförde. And there is an interesting comment in Böckenförde when he said, you know, the liberal democracies rest on a premise that they are not able to maintain over time. There is something that is pre-constitutional, pre-institutional, comes before. And the institution can do something, but they are not able alone to maintain this unity, these bonds among the people. Therefore, Joseph Weiler is not that interested in the usual analysis about the democratic crisis, the crisis of the rule of law, of the attacks of the judiciary, the erosion of the roles of parliaments, and so on. And yet, as a constitutional scholar, I see a connection between the two. You are speaking about the deep causes, but in my view, the surface, the external, the institutional expression of this fracture among the people is still not irrelevant. It has a role to play. It is, on the one side, it is an expression of a deeper fracture, but on the other hand, it is also a cause for deepening this fracture among the people. It's not; they are not two different planes. There is a link between the two of them. And into brackets, this is not only the Israeli problem. I have just consulted the VUDEM report 2024, saying that at the end of 2023, the 71% of the population in the world is living in an autocracy. There is a backsliding in democracies everywhere. It's not just the problem of some countries. But let's go back to my point. There is a connection between a fractured demos, a polarized society, and some institutional practices. The public discourse is permeated by, in my view, an oversimplified and exaggerated idea of democracy. A poor idea of democracy. It is true that at the heart of democracy you have the rule of the majority, but we are interpreting this rule, this principle, in the following way. We have election, there is one party, or more often a group of parties, winning the election. They express a strong leader and they take over all the institutional structure of the state. This is what is going on in many countries. You mentioned Poland, but it is exactly at the heart of the constitutional reform proposal in the Italian government. We want to elect the prime minister. The prime minister will decide the government and will have the majority in the parliament. So one person is capturing all the system, and as a spillover effect, controlling also the election of the president of the republic, the election of the judges in the constitutional court, and so on. In my view, this kind of proposals shows an oversimplified idea that implies that we are losing the sense that of pluralism in the institution, of different views living together, their capacity of coming to compromise. Compromise has become a bad word. The idea of compromise is on getting to agreement, reaching common points between different visions of the states and of the world, is something that is not good. Is something that it's for weak leaders. It is not for a good, strong politician, because the strong politician and strong leader has clear mind, straight decision, and divides black and white into the world. I have a number of possible examples. In this case, the most clear in my country is the following one. And in this moment, Italy has a government, a right-wing government elected by the people, made of a coalition of 3 political parties. Fratelli d'Italia, the party of the leader, Giorgia Meloni, and then the Lega Nord, very sensitive. In the past, it was one of that was, championing the idea of secession and more autonomy for the regions. And then Forza Italia, the party that was founded by Silvio Berlusconi. The main topic and the main focus of this party was about the justice system. If you open the agenda, the political agenda in Italy, it is very interesting in these days because just yesterday the 3rd proposal of constitutional reform was put in place. What are these 3 proposals of constitutional reforms, not legislative ordinary policies of the states? The first one is advocated by Fratelli d'Italia. It is the idea of the premiership, this direct election of the premier, and then the prime minister decides all the rest. The second one is enhancing differentiated regional autonomy on the model of the Spanish system. And this is promoted by the League. The third one, just approved yesterday, is a reform of the justice system, splitting the careers of the justices and the prosecutors, exactly, which was the old idea of Berlusconi. This is, in my view, is interesting because it is the same majority with the 3 different parties that want to change something at the constitutional level with the 3 different proposals. Everyone wants to say, I have my proposal, I have my identity, I want the people, to support and to be I want to be the father of this specific proposal. In my view, as a constitutional lawyer, this is really a nonsense. The constitutional level is the level where you find agreement, where you decide the rules of the game, where you decide the common values regardless who is in the majority. You try to have shared and common vision. You try to find compromises. The history of the Italian Republic is very interesting because it was a deeply divided society. You had the Christian Democrats and the communists, looking at different geographical and geopolitical scenarios in different ways in that moment. It was dramatic division inside the nation and outside the world. And still, they were fighting at the level of the government because, De Gasperi in May 1947 expelled the communists from the government, but still they were working together until the very end of the writing of the Constitution. Now, even when we touch the constitutional level, we are not able to find an agreement, and we want to say, this is my reform, not only between the majority and the opposition, but within different parties that are in the same majority. For me, this is what we are losing in political life. The ability to recognize that there is something good that comes from the proposal of a different party. That we can find something that unifies, that is common, that we can share, even if it is not me, my political parties, that is the drafter of this proposal. So, in my view, this is something that is poisoning the political life, because whatever is coming, the proposal is coming from the majority, you will have the opposition of the minority parties and the opposite. There is no way to find, the possibility of discussing and deliberating on the content of the proposals, because it is simply a matter of identity. If it comes from the Republicans, the Democrats should contest the proposal and the opposite one. Yaniv was saying something very important. He was saying we are losing the common good, the common interest, the interest of the nation, of the people. And the result, in my view, is clear. In my country, more than 30% of the population does not go to vote for the elections. The winning party is the abstention party in my country. Why? Because politics appears to be just a political game for those who are in power. But in any case, my personal life, my specific problem, the problem of having the money to raise my children and so on, will not be affected by those who are in power. Regardless they are left-wing or right-wing, I am not interested, because I am disappointed, and especially the young generation are so disappointed that they are not interested in our countries to engage in a political life or public discourse and so on. So, my reading is that this result, this impossibility to rule together, at least when there are fundamental issues at stake, has a deep cultural origin. There are probably many origins. I would like to bring my contribution to this discussion, focusing on a point that I consider very relevant in many different domains. Let me read a phrase of a book that I do not support in all the conclusion, but in my view is very useful to focus on a point that I consider very relevant. Relationships are central to people's lives, to who we are, to the capacities we are able to develop, to what we value, what we suffer, and what we enjoy. And yet, relationships are at the periphery of the legal and political discourse. Who speaks about what is a good, healthy relationship? I mean, at the personal level, social level, but even at the level of institutions. Who puts and focus the attention of a good relation between parliament and government, between courts and political bodies? It's not a topic for scholarship, for discussion, and even less in the public discourse. But there are so many things that cannot be done without good relations. I was mentioning Iris, an example. There is now this new wave of climate litigation. I'm finishing, sorry, I'm a little bit too long now. And some courts were very bold, the German court and also the European Court of Human Rights, saying, okay, the government are not doing enough. They accepted the Paris Agreement, they entered in these treaties, but then they are not putting the money, or they are postponing and shifting the burden of these policies on the future generation and so on. So some courts are striking down the measure on climate change because they are not, they do not go far enough in promoting the values of environments and so on and so forth. But what a court can do about the climate change if after the decision the government does not decide to follow the decision of the court? It's a useless decision. It's no capacity of changing the reality at all. But in some countries, like in Germany, for example, the authority of the court is so relevant that the government in a couple of weeks followed the decision of the court and gave the follow-up to the decision. So it was immediately implemented. In other cases, it is not the same. There are decisions of the court that are simply ignored. Here, what is the issue? The issue is the problem of loyal cooperation, good connection, proper relationship between the institution. There is one of our colleagues, an Irish woman, Aileen Kavanagh, that has just written a book about collaborative constitutionalism, putting the finger on the problem of relationship. Not only she's speaking at the institutional level, but you can also say the same at the social level. I think that there is a missing word, a missing point in our culture, which is how to build, how to maintain good, safe, and healthy relationship. This was clear, much clearer in those who were rebuilding the society after World War II. It was clear in our own experience in Italy. All the Italian constitution is relational. The kind of person, human being that is implied by the Declaration of Fundamental Rights in Italy, Article 2, is a human being, a person, human person in relation to other. Even the Constitution, the titles of the chapter of the Constitution, when they describe the rights of the people, are divided into 4 chapters named after relation: civil relation, social relation, political relation, economic relation. The person, the individual is nothing, I don't want to overlook the individual, but is nothing without the relation with the family, the school, the sports, the association, the political bodies, and so on. And even the frame of government is relational. A central element of the Italian frame of government is Article 94, which speaks about the confidence relationship between the parliament and the government. But this is not explored, is overlooked absolutely. And if we move to Europe, well, I cannot speak about the origin of Europe with Joseph Weiler, which was one of the first that wrote, the best books ever about the history of the European Union. But this was all about relationship between enemies, between countries that were on opposite sides during the war. I just want to finish on this point with I would not say a positive note, but at least a small light at the end of the tunnel. When these people that decided to, imagine the European Union as an instrument for keeping peace in the continent. This is what I learned from my mentor. The European Union was a political intuition. It was a political enterprise because the ultimate goal of Europe was peace and prosperity on the continent. The economic was instrumental, but it was political since the beginning. How to get to this ambitious goal of keeping peace in Europe? Well, the words were said in the Schuman Declaration. The project can only be reached by de facto solidarity, step by step. De facto solidarity. That's why they decided to put up the coal and steel community, because it was a small enterprise, but put together France and Germany, that were enemies, on a specific, concrete, practical enterprise together where they had common interests. My feeling, even in this country, is that at the social level, we practice much more solidarity than in the public discourse, in the institutional and the political level. I am not dreaming about easy solution in any kind of country, not even mine. But if there is a lesson that we can learn from previous history, I think that it is about this possibility of starting to rebuild bonds, relationship, connection among people, starting on small and practical proposals, something that can be done even in a tiny size, but that over time can change the culture, putting together the importance of common relation and being part of a common demos. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marta. Before we're almost finished, we have about 10-15 minutes before we close. I invited two people to comment, and I would like first to thank Dr. Shirley Nave and Dr. Meital Pinto and her students of constitutional class who are joining us here. I invited Dr. Meital Pinto and Dr. Elad Gil, the head of research in Tachlit, to comment. But before I invite them, I just want to make one remark to Joseph. You talked about subjective understanding of the demos. I think in the Israeli case, we need also to consider external perspectives. Because for those people who surround Israel, they don't care what's happening inside. They regard the demos and the Jewish people as one demos, regardless of how fragmented the society is. So in the Israeli case, we have no other option but be united. So I think this makes things even more complicated than just looking at the things from an internal perspective. Dr. Elad Gil, would you please join us at the podium and for some response?
All right. I'm too old. I need glasses now. Professor Cartabia, Professor Weiler, hi everyone. It is such an honor to hear your insights on the toxic relationship between democracy and polarization. Listening to you, I wondered what I could add to today's discussion, and I think the best I can do in the short time I have is maybe to share with you some of my own experiences, to provide a first-hand account of what looked to me as a cycle of polarization and democratic decline, as I have seen unfolding through the 2023 judicial overhaul that was in Israel. And what I saw, in brief, was that us Israelis, the demos, we're like mice on a treadmill these days. We're stuck. We're stuck in a vicious cycle. Political polarization in Israel has created conditions that lead us to democratic decline, and the struggle to preserve democracy often amplifies polarization, which then in turn further threatens our democracy. And I think it resonates a little bit with the catch-22 that you, Professor Weiler, was speaking about. So let me, just for a few minutes, try to unpack that idea and maybe start thinking about the ways ahead. So you see, Israel has always been a diverse society. Arabs and Jews, Mizrahi and Ashkenazi, ultra-Orthodox and secular, nationalists, socialists, we have everything. And despite this diversity that was with us from day one, our political system usually leaned towards the middle. Governments from both sides preferred to work with the moderates. And one famous example, most of you are probably too young to remember, but during the 1980s, then Prime Minister Shamir, from the right-wing Likud party, refused even to exchange words on the floor of parliament with the representative of the extreme right, let alone to form a government with them. However, in recent years, political identities in Israel have become deeply intertwined with religious and cultural identities, leading to hardened and more extreme views, especially but not exclusively on the right. And this made political compromise and dialogue increasingly difficult. We have seen Prime Minister Netanyahu, unlike Prime Minister Shamir, he did reach out to the extreme right. And he did form a government that relies on their support. And he did so, it should be noted, with the support of the majority of his constituents. And then in recent years, our parliament, the Knesset, turned into a polarized, angry, and dysfunctional place. Populism has taken root at the heart of our government, and on this unstable ground, a populist constitutional reform emerged last year. Why populism thrives in polarized societies? I think one reason is that the main goal in politics, and this is true to both everyday politics and higher constitutional politics, the main goal becomes keeping your opponent out of power. You don't trust them. You despise them. You doubt their patriotism. So you fight them with everything you got. And for the proponents of the judicial overhaul, that opponent, it was the Supreme Court. They took it to the institutional level. They were willing to shift immense power to the executive, undermining our already very fragile checks and balances system, risking our democracy, just for the goal of limiting the Supreme Court. And in their eyes, the risk was worth it. Now, in many other countries, constitutions may act as barriers against such a populist constitutional change, but not in our case. Because of the overly flexible and weak constitutional structure we live in, our constitution could not and did not save our democracy. our democracy saved the Constitution. To be more precise, the demos, the elites, the tech sector, the reservists, the students, and countless ordinary Israelis mobilized to protect it. But as the protest movement solidified, something else has happened. Suddenly, reaching out to the other side, having any kind of political or social relationship with them, it became, I think the best word I can use, it became uncool. Standing your ground was cool. Embracing identity politics from the other side became cool. Loving the court, I love Bagatz, if you remember the slogan. Hating politics was in fashion. And so when, just a year ago, last spring, the negotiations between the coalition and the opposition, under the auspices of the president, on the future of our Constitution began, I've seen the paralyzing effect of polarization, of hate. I can attest to at least 3 instances where a path forward, a resolution, even an interim resolution, seemed possible. But every time, the politicians were unwilling, perhaps unable, to choose compromise over extremism. So it was not surprising, obviously, coming from the government, since its very existence was relying on the extreme right. But to my surprise, the immense energy of the protest movement left very little room for compromise as well. And the politicians inside the negotiation rooms, they took note of it. No one was brave enough, no one was willing, no one wanted to be accused of collaborating with the bad guys, with the destroyers of democracy. So the fight against the judicial overall, while successful so far, ended up deepening our polarization. And so the vicious cycle continues. When citizens become entrenched in their beliefs, refuse to engage in differing opinions, it undermines some of the fundamental, but perhaps a little bit forgotten principles of democracy. Compromise, dialogue, the search for common ground, and ultimately the underlying belief that there is such a thing as common good. In a recent book called 2 Cheers for Politics, Why Democracy is Flawed, Frightening, and Our Best Hope, Professor Jed Party put it nicely, I think, saying, if we lose democracy, it may be out of fear of one another. As legal professionals, what can we do? What can be our role in breaking this wicked cycle? I'm not sure I have the best answer, but I think that at the very least, we should be the ones to put some reason in the conversation. We must ensure that debates about the future of Israel's constitution rise above the ugly realities of identity politics. They should be rational, principled, balanced, always based on the search for broad agreement. It's easy nowadays to cheer for the court, to despise politics, to despise politicians. It's easy to stand our ground and reject any change that entails risks. But this sort of political nihilism is very dangerous in the long run. We will not save our democracy unless we make it less polarized. Our democracy cannot be just a long list of landmark Supreme Court cases. We must have a strong Supreme Court, but that's not sufficient. in Israel's context, I think that the future of our ongoing and very long constitutional project, it can go two ways. And again, it resonates some of what I've heard from Professor Weiler about what's going on in Poland these days. The idea of constitutionalism in Israel's context can serve two different goals. There is one type of constitutionalism that can be used to entrench polarization. A majority of Knesset members today or after the next elections can shape the rules of the democratic game that make it impossible or very hard for the others, the bad guys, whoever they are, to participate, to have a voice. And that was essentially the judicial overhaul. It was an attempt to change the rule of the games to benefit one side. But there is another type of constitutionalism, one that can enhance democracy, safeguarding basic norms while embracing the idea of collective authorship, of the fact that the Constitution must be for all of us and by all of us. It will take courage, and especially these days, it takes some imagination maybe, and it will definitely lead to norms and settlements we might not like. It demands self-doubt, and it will be the longer road to a constitution. But the question for us, I guess, and for you, everybody here, the law students especially, and I'll end with that, is which type of constitutionalism do you prefer? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elad. For final remarks, I invite Dr. Meital Pinto. Thank you. I know that some students have other classes beginning, so feel free, if you need to leave, you can leave now. But Meital has a very short, I think, remark, so please, if you can stay, you'll still get a few minutes break.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a very important discussion. So I'll be very, very short. And thank you for my students that come here. Although you're free to go, I know you have other classes. I think, and I will mainly speak about Israel, I think that the problem in Israel is even more peculiar than in other places. Because Professor Weiler was talking about territorial autonomy. Now, there are other solutions to groups that do not feel part of the nation, that say we're different nations. For instance, I was a part of a research group about non-territorial autonomy. But even non-territorial autonomy, the idea is to give autonomy to basically to minority groups that are not divided along territorial borders. But even the idea of non-territorial autonomy is not possible in Israel with regard to the Jewish majority, because we are speaking not about people who do not call themselves Jews. We are all, I think, within the Jewish majority, where we all perceive ourselves as Jews. So non-territorial autonomy can maybe be offered to national minority groups such as the Arab Palestinians, citizens of Israel. So as Professor Cartabia said, there are no easy solutions, but in my mind, in Israel, we can start thinking about a solution only if we first try to understand what being Israeli means, not what being a Jew means. Okay? All my life, I felt more Israeli than Jewish, although I'm Jewish, yeah? But when I'm trying to articulate what being Israeli means, it's very hard. And I think we should devote all our efforts to try to define our Israeliness, which should try to define what makes us nations, a nation, Jews and non-Jews alike. And I think that the problem in Israel that we don't have any common denominator. We don't have any notion of civic solidarity. My friend here, Professor Tamar Ostovsky-Brandes, wrote extensively about the issue of solidarity. It's absent in Israel. And civic solidarity is about relations between citizens. What makes us different than citizens in the US? I think we might be wise to ask people from abroad who come to Israel, hey, what you see here? What you feel in Israel that you don't feel in other places? And the problem to reach this common denominator, the idea of civic solidarity, is of course more problematic when we face polarization, when we face deeply divided society. So it's nearly impossible to agree on common principles, common ideas that make us Israelis, common ideas that make our civic solidarity exist. But we must do so. And I tend to agree with Dr. Gil here that we should encourage compromises. But at the same time, we cannot, in the name of compromises, give power to people who wish only to discriminate or to say that other groups in Israel are not legitimate. We have to reach compromises between all groups in society. I did my PhD in Canada, in University of Toronto. I also consider myself sort of Canadian. I don't have a Canadian citizenship, of course. But I think that the effort that was done in Canada in 1982, when the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was enacted, is a very good model. Because the then Prime Minister, the father of the current Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, when he initiated the idea of enacting the Charter, he insisted that all groups in Canadian society will be part of the compromise, will be part of the discussions of what being a Canadian means. And look at their beautiful charter. Thank you.
Professor Marta Cartabia, Professor Joseph Weiler, Dr. Meital Pinto, Dr. Elad Gil, dear guests, thank you so much for coming. We only start the debate now, the conversation.